Well, I study the spread of the Catholic religion and miracles, and I came to it sort of out of random chance and serendipity, which have actually become a major argument in many of my history articles. I didn't wake up one morning and decide that I wanted to be a historian of miracles. Actually, I had a bunch of very good history professors who I liked for different reasons, and part of the problem was that they all studied different time periods and different regions. So I had one professor of the French Revolution who I really liked, one of colonial Latin America, one of Renaissance Italy and Germany, another one of the Middle Ages, and so I was trying to pick a dissertation topic that would allow me to work with everyone I liked. It's very difficult to find a topic that bridges that many time periods. So someone suggested to me that I try to look at the Catholic Church and missionaries because they travel everywhere, so I wouldn't have to focus on one time or place. And so originally I started working on the Franciscans, and I took a research trip to Bolivia and ended up having a lot of Indiana Jones style adventures down there because of difficulty of access. So I got locked in a monastery, I got lost in these Franciscan missions, and during the month that I was down there I ended up meeting some Jesuits. It's the first Jesuits who I had ever met. They were very rational and sane and organized, and exactly the opposite of my chaotic research experience. So when I came back from Bolivia, I thought, I'm going to change to research the Jesuits. So I started looking for Jesuit topics, and I found an article by a French-Canadian scholar called André Sanfason, who studies the Holy House of Loretto, which is one of the more interesting and spectacular miracles in the Catholic Church. It involves a house falling out of the sky in 1295 on the coast of Italy. And then the Virgin Mary appeared in a vision and said that it was her original house from Nazareth, flown by angels, and it had stopped in a couple of places before it ended up in Italy. And this was a really interesting miracle, and André Sanfason, in a footnote, noticed that he just commented that there were a lot of Jesuits who were very interested in the Holy House, so much so that they were actually rebuilding copies of it to exact size in the wilderness in frontier missions. And he just kind of threw out there in the footnote, why? Why would Jesuits, who are associated with a lot of the rational, scientific forms of Catholicism, be so taken by this very strange miracle? And that's where I latched onto my research topic.
So have you stayed with the Holy House, or have you expanded to other miracles?
So far I've actually stayed with the Holy House, but I've looked at a lot of the associated threads from the Holy House. So when I started to study how the Holy House of Loretto was taken to other parts of the world, I noticed that the Jesuits were frequently transplanting other parts of the devotion. So the icon of the Madonna of Loretto, it's one of Mary's black form, it's one of the European black Madonnas. And so sometimes they would take the icon and kind of tweak it. They would whiten it to take it out to some of the indigenous missions. So I looked at the image of Mary. Sometimes they would also just name missions after Loretto with no explanation. So there's some in the Amazon River Basin and in Baja California. And so I looked at names, what it means when missionaries actually assign a name to it, and how much of the details of the devotion travel along with images and names and relics like the Holy House.
So, and what did you find out?
As is, I think, frequently the case with historians, I went in with like this huge plan of what I was sure I was going to find, and found something totally different. The Jesuits, I think there's been a lot of scholarship written about them recently about how they were hyper-organized and a very strong network. So when I started my research, I was sure that I would find some Jesuits posted in Loretto, Italy, who had kind of a master strategy and plan for spreading Loretto specifically to the rest of the world. And I thought I would find plans for the Holy House, a lot of letters and correspondence, instructions to people for how to do this, and kind of a support network. And instead, I ended up finding that the Jesuits at the sites that I looked at frequently did not know each other. Some of them had not been to Loretto. Some of them had heard of other replicas of Loretto, but they were kind of, a lot of them were functioning informally and not monitored and not with the consent or spurring of their superiors. And that's something that's not usually told about the Jesuits. So that definitely interested me. This kind of dynamic of not very high-profile Jesuits who took parts of Catholicism that spoke to them and just kind of transplanted that under the radar.
Oh, so you had sort of people opening their own little House of Loretto franchises.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So why, of all the things you could take to the mission field, the flying house?
The flying house, right. People had different reasons. I was a little disappointed actually as a graduate student because I had really lionized the Jesuits and thought that they did everything with a purpose. Everything was strategic and deliberate. One of my favorite Jesuits is a Frenchman called Pierre-Joseph-Marie Chameneau, and he's one of the ones who built one of the more famous replicas because he built it to scale in Canada among the Huron. And he built it for personal reasons. He'd had a really interesting experience. He was a runaway when he was a child, and he ran away, was not even planning on going to Loretto. He just kind of sidetracked there, and he was ill from roaming the roads, and he prayed to the Virgin of Loretto, and he felt better. He had a healing experience there, and he promised when he was better that he would pay tribute to her, and he chose to do it with a house at the end of his career among the Huron. So it was a very personal thing. It wasn't so much like, this is going to teach the indigenous people to really appreciate Catholicism. It was kind of his thing. And he did end up sharing it. I did look at how the Huron kind of responded to that house and how they incorporated it then into their own spirituality. But it was very much not this Jesuit plan to export something that was going to really illuminate non-Christians. And it was similar in some of the other sites that I looked at. There's another Jesuit who I followed, Juan Maria Salvatierra, who was Italian. He ended up getting posted to Mexico, and he left kind of a trail of these Holy House replicas. Some were in Jesuit colleges in some of the cities in Mexico, and some were out in the field. Some were exact models, and some looked nothing like the Holy House. He would just build a little house and be like, that's Loretto. And he kind of had this partnership with a friend, Juan Bautista Zappa, who was also building holy houses. And it was a little bit of, I think, informal competition between the two to see who could build the most. And they would remind each other in letters, please remember, I've built 3. I'm just saying. So that was kind of an interesting support network. And also, he was actually one of the few Italians who I found. At first I thought it was an Italian thing because this is in Italy. And so I thought maybe the Italian Jesuits were diffusing it. But then I also found a bunch of non-Italians in the Mojos missions, the Jesuit Mojos missions in the Amazon River Basin. And they actually named one of their missions Loretto because of the liturgical calendar. It was on the Feast of the Annunciation. And so that was associated with the Madonna of Loretto. So they just called their main mission site Loretto Mojos, and that's how the people there came to be affiliated with it.
This is actually the stuff I like best about Catholic stories is you couldn't make them up.
Yes.
They're just true. I learned that's true of Chinese stories too. It's the same thing. I think maybe a sort of touchstone of interest, if not authenticity, that they're stranger than you can imagine.
Absolutely.
So what do the indigenous people in the world who are chugging along doing their indigenous things, think when somebody comes and builds a little house and tells them that this is a replica of a house that flew a great distance?
Well, I think they had two. There are many different reactions. My two favorites are actually quite positive sorts of reaction. One is kind of responding to this sort of Disney World style, you know how Disney builds those sort of experiential, like they build a castle so that kids can learn what a castle is like, right? Sort of a walk-through experience. You can kind of touch it and pretend you're part of that world. So I think one positive reaction was for them to respond very much to the kind of tactile, life-size walk-through. Well, maybe this does help us to sort of imagine what the mother of Jesus lived like, right? And the Holy House of Loretto is a very humble structure. It's a very small kind of brick or stone structure. So that seemed to appeal to them. The other thing is, especially among the Huron in Canada, have a very interesting reaction because there's sort of a response that it puts them on the map because they're actually being affiliated not just with Catholicism in general, but with a specific Catholic site. So they actually, that Huron Catholic community, created a wampum belt that they sent back to the Shrine of Loretto with a note that said that they were kind of partners now. And when Jesuits at that Loretto site responded from Italy and wrote back to them, they got really excited and then started sending wampum belts everywhere. They sent it to Chartres, Dinant. They just started picking sites in Europe, Marian sites, and also new mission sites in Canada. And they would sign everything as the Huron of Lorette. And then you also have these European atlas makers who go through and actually count the number of Lorettos. And it's sort of a marker of triumph. They're like, there are 75 Lorettos scattered all over the world, and this clearly means something. And so they're actually, it goes two ways. You have the indigenous peoples seeing it as a link, and then you have the people in Europe counting it as a link.
Well, there must have been indigenous folks who got a house for whom building things was a very big deal.
Uh-huh.
In Ecuador, it would have been a very big deal to build something.
Absolutely.
In other places, it wasn't.
So this house, it exists.
It does.
The one that allegedly flew.
Mm-hmm.
You can visit it and go in it.
You can still go there today. It's a major pilgrimage site. Today, the Madonna of Loretto is actually the patron saint of the Italian Air Force because she flies. And she was also taken to the moon. She's associated with kind of crossing air boundaries. She leaps oceans. She moves. And that's kind of one of the things that drew me to her as well, because I'm interested in how religion moves, and this is kind of the poster miracle for it. She just appears.
Yeah, it's also the Wizard of Oz, for crying out loud.
It
the
is.
Flying house.
It is.
Yeah.
There's also all sorts of interesting dynamics with the original miracle of Loretto, in that one of the weird things that was preserved in her mythohistory is that she stopped a number of times before ending up in Italy, and one of the places that she stopped was in Dalmatia, in a town called Tersat, which is near Rijeka in Croatia today. And some of the Slavic Catholics there in the 1500s actually started doing these mass pilgrimages to Loretto, kind of crying and asking her to come back. So there's this interesting bridging over shores. People who have supposedly been left behind by her, and what I was focusing on in the story is that she didn't just stop in Italy, but when the Jesuits carried her elsewhere in the world, there are other Lorettos that have kind of gained more prominence now than the site, that people would know about more today. Like the Huron of Lorette actually were one of the more active converted Christian communities, so they were kind of more high profile at certain moments in time than Loretto in Italy. So you get this weird interconnection of Lorettos.
So how's the record from the arrival of the house?
It's very layered, so that's also one of the things that drew me to the project. I'm not really interested in conventional histories, but I like ones that really focus on the layering and how a myth grows. And what appealed to me about Loretto is that it has a very Wikipedia style of construction, where it starts out with someone sort of making an entry about what the Holy House is, and then you have all of these kind of self-appointed amateurs who kind of add what they know onto the story, and then people repeat that, and it grows, and you have a couple of places where there's clearly a citation needed being inserted by the authorities, but the story lives and gets repeated and added onto, even eventually by the Huron and the Slavs in Dalmatia and the Indians and the Mohos. So the actual origin story, there are archives in Loretto that refer to lost papers previously, but the first published account was actually done in the 1500s by a secretary of a neighboring city, and he's the one who actually reported on the basis of oral history and eyewitnesses, and also apparently this neighboring town of Recanati sent an expedition to the Holy Land to look to see if they could find the foundations of Mary's holy house. To measure it, to see if that was there, and they came back and said that it was indeed there. They also checked out supposedly its stop in Dalmatia to see if it was there as well. And so that part of the myth also musters a lot of evidence that used to really hold water for people in the 1300s and 1400s, where oral history, eyewitness accounts really mattered, and also miracles that were associated with the site. So there's a lot of reported visions of people having Mary actually confirm that she was at the site. In the 1960s, the Catholic Church actually organized archaeological excavations around the site to verify, and did some interesting modern updating of the account. So what they did was they showed, the archaeological excavations showed that the house is not, it really is on a road, it has no foundation, and it's made of very old materials that are not from the area. So those are things which technically could sort of bolster the evidence. And they also made a small edit because in the early mythohistory of Loretto, they said that angels carried the Holy House, and the Catholic Church revised it to say that it was a merchant family called Angeli that brought it from the Holy Land. And again, to me, I love that revision because it just sort of shows how people really like to speak to the audiences of their own times and present information that's verifiable, right? So in the 20th century, people were a little more skeptical about angels, so there's this need to sort of make real people carry it.
But, I mean, I take it that it's remarkable if it flew, and it's somewhat less remarkable if it floated.
Yes, although there are actually a couple of very prominent Marian pilgrimage sites that have Marys that float in. There's a whole series of, I think, 8th century ones. They date after this period of iconoclasm, sort of in the Byzantine Empire, where you have these, I'm thinking of like the Madonna of Tindari, who apparently appeared as an icon just in a boat washed up, and it was just this icon and the gospel in Syriac. That was enough. I think part of what makes this particular case exceptional is that she arrived by air, so there's not sort of the ocean connection, and also with a house. Normally it's an icon. The house part is unusual.
So things flying in or floating in.
Floating in is
fairly common.
Fairly common.
Flying house somewhat rare.
Not so much. Yes.
Got it. Okay. So this is as it were a genre of traveling Marys who don't just sort of teleport.
Right.
And this is kind of at the edge of that genre.
Yes. And you do have people, I mean, the devotion to Loretto actually existed before this, but you do have a lot of Italian officials making much of the fact that she flew and landed in Italy, and she was actually walking distance from Rome, so she became a major pilgrimage site for Rome. So the Pope, there were a couple of early popes who actually paid visits and stuff, and it turns into a little bit of papal icon of power, right? she didn't just fly anywhere. She flew and landed close to Rome, and clearly that communicates something to everybody, right?
But a sub.
Yes. Right.
She's not going to act the traffic and the smell of the great big city.
Right.
Patrons say to me, Dinah, yeah, you've got this is
fresh air.
Great.
Yeah.
You can have a horse if you want a horse, or a donkey. I love it. This is so great. Well, and it, it takes me back to my origins. Actually, my origins with the Institute, because when I first came to do the Bat with the Institute, I did the director, Ann Waltner, and her patron saint is a Taoist mystic who, at the end of her short life at age 24, ascended into heaven in front of something like 130,000 of her followers, yes. Probably the best attested flying in the history of the world. Her relatives said, "Could you please just die if you have to go? We're really important people, and if we don't have a body, people ask questions. And I'm a woman. People don't believe me if I don't fly." She flew a lot, but I remember asking Anne, "Well, what do you tell your classes about this flying business?"
Yeah.
She said, "I say she flew." So, do you tell your classes the house flew?
I do, but I have trouble with my 21st century perspective, not either laughing or saying that with a slight amount of skepticism. One of the things I like about the flying in the Loretto miracle is that it's difficult. It's challenging for us to understand. And I feel like part of its staying power is that in the 1300s, as with today, it's something that sort of stops analysis because it is so difficult to explain, and immediately makes you sort of sort it into a category of the impossible. You can't ask too many questions about it because it's impossible, so you just have to either believe it or not. And a part of me really resists that. I want to find answers, right? I want to even find if it actually floated in, or if real people built it, or, it's really easy to get behind the metaphor of flying. It's harder to actually say, as Ann Waltner does, and I've heard her actually speak about her mystic, that this woman flew, and it was witnessed, right, by many people, and so repeatedly. So it happened. But I am part of a group of historians. Actually, we all study miracles in different forms and different kinds of miracles, and flying presents a special case in these this range of miracles of apparitions and God speaking to people or things appearing. Each kind of miracle presents a different challenge in terms of trying to decipher what really happened, or whether we should or not, right? So we're actually trying to put, I think, our disciplines very much to the test, especially history, to try to figure out how we can approach these as serious evidence. How can we talk about them seriously as historians without without distorting them?
Well, I remember back, my first real history class was with Calrezzo at McAllister. Actually, combination of him and a colleague who moved away later. But they basically said, look, the principles of history are clear. If we let supernatural events in, we have no explanatory power anymore. I mean, you have to assume that something holds steady, and we have to assume that physics holds steady, or we're dead.
Right.
That puts us in a weird position with regard to New Testament materials. But as an historian, that's the only way you can go. Or anyway, they were quoting people who were saying things like that. And so I used to revisit him, decades after I graduated, and say, is that you're still so hard-headed about these things?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wasn't that just some sort of 19th century rationalistic prejudice? Where are historians these days on that sort of stuff? So I ask you the same question. Where are historians these days on supernatural happenings?
The group of historians that I work with are trying to actually get somewhere different. It's hard to, because the traditional view is exactly that, right? History is verifiable facts. And these are things that are hard to actually prove. But I feel like where it trips historians up is that definitely there are many events that happen that people can't explain, whether they have natural causes or supernatural causes. Strange things happen. If we are to actually reckon with those events and deal with the way that they intrude in the historical record, we have to acknowledge the supernatural more than is being done today. I'm not finding a lot of historians who are doing this. There are some scholars of the supernatural. Jeffrey Kripal is one of them. And he studies the paranormal, actually, ESP, UFOs. And he's actually trying to develop a methodology for actually taking some of these supernatural things seriously. There's also Robert Orsi. He's a scholar of religion, and he's talking about Marian apparitions. So he's actually trying to consider how he calls it abundant history, how certain events like apparitions of Mary create these different layers of intense emotion where people actually respond to something that they don't understand by layering it in a certain way. So you can recognize that something strange happened there, something supernatural. And he's saying that these sorts of events call for a different kind of history, a different kind of analysis in order to get back to that real experience. So a lot of it focuses on flipping the question, because a lot of times historians, the first question they ask when faced with the holy house falling from the sky is did that really happen? Could that really happen? Or what happened? And there's a way to flip the question and assume instead that something real happened. So to ask instead what really did happen and what resonates from that moment, instead of assuming from the get-go that because flying was part of it, it never really occurred.
Now, I'm curious about these Jesuits in just that regard. I mean, the first time you ran into them, you liked them because they were so organized and rational, and unlike some other folks you might have run into, Franciscans come to mind. But the other thing about Jesuits I can never forget is that they actually invented lying. I mean, the way of thinking about telling an elaborate falsehood is Jesuit stuff, okay? And so one question I have is, do you think the Jesuits who were promoting this thing also believed that a house flew?
I think they did. And one of the things that's actually quite different about the Jesuits who I've looked at and the way that they deal with their replica holy houses is that they don't actually ever assert that it's the real house of the Virgin Mary. They present it as something special, but there's not a lot of the dialoguing or exposition that you would associate, for instance, with some of the Jesuit intellectuals who went to China, like Matteo Ricci, where they're having these big discussions about philosophy, right? With the Holy House and with when the explanations that I've seen about miracles around it, it was not about explanation and not about the rational. It was just basically like, here is something that is very special and amazing that moved us because we don't understand it. And the point is not necessarily to understand it, but to rejoice that it happened. And that's actually still the official Jesuit lying today. It's not so much about lying or trying to rationalize that it happened, but it's sort of the Catholic Church stance on miracles that the Jesuits still articulate very well, which is that a miracle, by definition, is in a category that is not explainable. So they're not even going to try. It's not even a lie. It's just think about it, and the more you resist believing that it happened, the more powerful it is, right? Because there it is.
The other thing I know about Jesuits is that they invented. I mean, I learned this partly from Ann Waltner. Is that they invented and articulated this trick of the memory house.
Yes.
So they have an affinity with houses.
They do. They like houses.
And houses as it were things to hang meaning on.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating.
And it's very nostalgic too in the early days of the order, because some of the early Jesuits were sort of charged with going out into the world and not having a home. So the point was to actually wander like Jesus, like St. Ignatius, right? And to be without a home, and to find many different homes. So I feel like, especially in the period that I'm writing about, the 1500s, 1600s, it's relatively early days of the order, there's a real nostalgia when they talk about physical homes, because they've had so many homes.
Yeah, and of course, there's the sort of haunting thing from the Gospels. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head.
Yes.
He doesn't have a home.
Mm-hmm. And it actually has a lot of resonance, for instance, in the Mojos, where a lot of the first missions were actually refugee communities of different indigenous groups who were resettling, relocating because of the disruptions of European settlement. So you get these aggregations of people who also have no homes. So it becomes a real bonding around the church as a home, basically.
So it becomes kind of an image for all of these gazillion refugee communities.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a house.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yep. Uh-huh.
It's fascinating. Now your interest in this, as you said before, is in sort of how religious ideas spread, and this becomes both an example and a model, a kind of example and a metaphor for that.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you learn from this about the spread of religious stuff?
That's a good question. I feel like you learn exactly the opposite of what history books today say about Catholic expansion. So I feel like a lot of college textbooks, high school textbooks actually say that the Catholic Church expanded partly because, or that it was partly a prepackaged export from Europe, right? Like you can think of the Bible or the Holy House, like it's an actual very specific European product that was put on a boat, sailed over, dropped in a new place, and continued there. And so that's kind of a model of imposition. It was brought by the Europeans and it was imposed. What I love about the miracle of Loretto is that it actually has a European history that goes very far back, that shows that the way that Catholicism was moving in Europe is similar to the way that it later moved in the rest of the world. And it's not imposition. It is a little bit more like a house dropping from a foreign place, whether it's Dalmatia or the Holy Land. It appears, and people are curious about it. It's not imposed. It doesn't come with an army. It comes from somewhere far away, and that's why people listen to it, because it's different, it's foreign, so they kind of take note of it, and then find their own ways of sort of explaining where it came from. And those explanations get bundled and move again. It's kind of the same drift model. And even when you trace its movement with the Jesuits, who are kind of the ultimate missionaries, right? The ones who sort of came with all this strategizing. The way they move Loretto is very separate from the rest of their pedagogy and strategizing. It is sort of this very casual dropping. This is a part of Catholicism that meant something to me, so I'm just going to put it here. And then you get people who are curious about it, who add their own overlay, and then chime in about it, and try to bridge back with the Catholic centers in Europe. So I guess, to me, what I learned from it is sort of a counterpoint to this model of direct export and imposition. It's more of, again, this communal curiosity and sort of this large group building of a very powerful story that transcends one region and one time and one missionary order.
Sounds a lot like the stories you hear about the Christianization of Ireland.
Huh, yeah.
I mean, there's a fairy in this well. Well, why don't you call it Jesus, okay?
Exactly. It doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as you acknowledge that it's special, right?
Yes, and this incredible syncretism, this incredible adoption of and an adaptation of native stuff, Santeria, that kind of thing. I mean, that isn't well known. People don't know how many different sorts of things evolved as local folks put their layers over what was there.
And the interesting difference to me between some of those Irish sites and the Santeria sites that you mentioned is that a lot of those sites were sacred previous to Christianity, and then when Christianity came, they sort of grafted on or latched onto existing religion. And to me, in a weird sort of way, the story of Loretto manages to really separate from place more than that. So to me, it resembles more like Star Wars or Harry Potter, and this is an incredibly heretical comparison, right? But it's where you have a really good story, and then it starts to develop a fan base, and then you start getting spin-offs, action figures, animated series. You start getting all these other people who are taking a story because it's good and because they love it and they like the characters, and they run with it. And soon it's no longer about George Lucas or J.K. Rowling. It's about a phenomena, a mass phenomena. And it's more about what interests me about it is how it moves and detaches from place.
Yeah, it's like a turtle that carries its placeness with it.
Yes.
Hopping about.
I like
its
the turtle image.
Its own sacred site, just plop down wherever it wants to. That's lovely. Think about that for a minute. Well, one thing about the Irish story, and I wonder if there's a counterpart, is, of course, the Irish then turning around and re-Christianizing Europe. Was visiting Hildegard of Bingen's old haunt in the Rhineland a few months ago. And, it's the major Irish foundation.
Absolutely.
So did the Flying House of Loretto? I mean, did people take it on other journeys? Did the people who got it, who had it sort of delivered to them, and send it on?
Take it farther, yeah. There are a couple of examples of it, and none are quite as dramatic as the Ireland case that you're thinking of, right? And it's partly because Loretto, I mean, in this case, I'm using Loretto as sort of an emblem of Catholic devotion in general, right? And it is kind of one devotion among many. But there is a case among the Cusco, the Inca, in the 1640s, where there's actually a confraternity in Cusco that's named after Loretto. So the Jesuits started Confraternity of Loretto, and as is often written about, a lot of the confraternities and religious groups in Cusco ended up being very enthusiastic, possibly more enthusiastic than the missionaries originally envisioned. So they would kind of take those symbolisms that were given to them and really make them resonate. So there's a lot of correspondence from the Jesuits in the 1640s who were worried because the Inca had decided they really liked this kind of idea of Loretto, and the confraternity of Loretto was taking on a power that kind of eclipsed all of the other lessons of Catholicism about Jesus and other saints, and that they were just really revved up about Loretto. And so there's a lot of anxiety among the Jesuits about how to actually get them to tone that down. So there are some examples of that, these moments when the Loretto story really spoke to indigenous groupings more than other aspects of Catholicism. But none that I've found so far where they actually take it elsewhere again. Yeah.
So it remains a sort of Jesuit monopoly.
Well, the Jesuits are actually not the only ones who are doing this. They're the ones who actually drew me into the story, but there are a lot of other people who are building replica holy houses who are not missionaries. There's kind of a little bit of holy house mania in Europe in the 1600s. And there's also a lot of Franciscans who are diffusing Loretto. They're actually the curators of the shrine today, or the Franciscans, not the Jesuits. So there's a lot of pan-Catholic interest in Loretto. So I don't think it's a Jesuit thing, no. They're just a very convenient way to sort of track some of the ways that it moved.
I see. Now, I mean, speaking as a lifelong church-going Catholic, it shocks me a bit that the flying house has not been part of my upbringing. Well, I'm sure if I had gone to a Catholic school, there would have been at least a session devoted to it. But there has to be, if there's a story of the rise of the house, the flying house, there has to be a story of the demise of the flying house.
There is.
What's that like?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it would be possibly 1800s, 1900s, where sort of with the rise of science and rationalism, it became a little bit awkward to explain the prevalence of this particular miracle. I think its heyday would have been the 1600s, possibly early 1500s into the late 1600s, and that was partly because of the Protestant Reformation, and at this particular point there was a lot of actually skepticism about the Holy House, and because it was such a spectacular miracle, it became a real marker of Catholicism. If you could believe in the Holy House, right, then you were a real Catholic. And if you could build one in your yard, that was even better, because it meant you were a real believer versus the Protestants, right? So it became a real symbol of that. And then it also had a lot of visual iconography of Mary on the house sort of moving that became a seal of certain cardinals, so it was stamped on a lot of things and became sort of a good visual symbol of how Catholicism expands, right? It's not an army. It's just this magical sort of, here comes Mary in her house. So for a while it became sort of a positive symbol of expansion. But then I think in the 1800s and 1900s, where the church started to deal with some of the fallout of sort of the darker moments of expansion, the armies, the Inquisition, a lot of that stuff started to get uglier interpretations, more cynical interpretations. It became a little bit of an embarrassment that had represented Catholicism, right? It became sort of not the image that the Catholic Church wanted to project about itself, and then it kind of got reined back in. So it's still a popular pilgrimage site and everything today, but it is kind of much more local, I think.
So I just was in museums a few months ago kind of getting stewed in images of the Counter-Reformation and that idea. Is this thing sort of an image on the banner of the Counter-Reformation? I mean, is this the kind of thing that would have led the charge against these boring Protestants?
Well, it's interesting because it's awkward for the church even at the first moments. For instance, with the building of holy houses, right? In the late 1500s, these holy house copies became incredibly popular, and the Pope actually instigated a ban against it because there were so many of them popping up that he was like, this is going to become very awkward to explain. It's just embarrassing. The Protestants are criticizing us for excess, and this is just, it's too much. So rein it in. So after this kind of burgeoning of holy houses, there is kind of a restriction on that. Also, within the Catholic Church, there's a lot of skepticism about the Holy House as well. So while on the surface, officially, they are condoning it as a miracle, some of the most searing criticisms that I have read about the authenticity of the Holy House are actually written by Catholics, believing Catholics, who are like, this is just not, this is not, it's something that's giving us difficulty believing. I think partly in combination, it's kind of that combination of external criticism from Protestants and internal criticism from some of their own that sort of unseat it, especially in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
I'm curious how any of this intersects with the kind of more contemporary Marian apparitions. In other words, into the 19th century, there was a ton of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And pilgrimage sites being founded and so forth, and central things. I mean, is there a kind of a war of confraternities, a war of a thought? Well, holy houses are pretty weird, but roses imprinted on a cloak. Now that I can buy. Or, healings. That's okay. Just not flying houses. How's it go?
I think, again, one of the fascinating things about Catholicism, and actually about many religions, is the space for variety. So I think in terms of the modern miracles, there's just so many different valences and different forms of miracle. You have the roses appearing on a cloak, you have the holy houses, and it's not so much competitive as sort of very tolerant of other forms. So I think there's a recognition when it's a similar genre of miracle, for instance, like with some of those rose ones and Marian apparitions, especially some of the recent miracles I'm thinking of, they are very place-oriented. It's a specific holy place where a holy apparition appears. And that place was marked as sacred even beforehand. And to me, that's, again, a very different kind of miracle that's locally rooted versus a weird foreign thing landing in your front yard. Right? Which seems to me, again, partly a creation of the 1500s, but also, again, it's something that I feel like existed in the Catholic Church, and that's in the mechanisms for religious movement before that, right? So again, it's, I think, a small subsection of miracles that deal with foreign arrivals that are sacred partly because they're foreign. It almost doesn't matter where they land, just that they keep moving and landing repeatedly.
The Christian version of Air Force One. Yes.
Possibly.
Such funny things. Well. I mean, there's Eliot's line, which I think takes gets at something very deep. I talk about a place where prayer has been possible and may be possible again. And I mean, I think there are people who actually, who deeply believe that there are places where it's possible. And one can luck into finding such a place.
Yeah.
And then it may be possible other places, but it starts from these very special places.
Right.
And they've probably been special since people were there.
Right.
In one way or another, springs and thin places and such like that.
Right.
And then there's the spirituality of this other spirituality that makes it not place dependent. And of course, if you're a refugee and your spirituality is a spirituality of place, then you actually can be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't, not just deprived of livelihood, but actually destroyed by being cut off from the place you live.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of resurgence? I mean, this is a century. You know, this is a time of great refugee problems. Do things come back?
Yeah. I have not heard of new or recent spreads of Loretto, though I was deeply amused by the fact that it has obviously, I mean, it was the Catholic Madonna that was chosen to be taken to the moon. I think there's an understanding of her as kind of an early prototype for sort of a portable Catholicism, right? Like this is something that we can take with us when we journey. I suspect partly because Catholicism today, as it was before, tends to reinvent itself, that if it does come up again, it will be in a different form. It might not necessarily be associated specifically with the Madonna of Loretto, but it would be a similar genre of miracle, right? With, again, I think some of the defining features are a foreign object that arrives without human hands necessarily, or without an explanation, just a very interesting foreign object that then reveals itself as a symbol of Catholicism.
Yeah, well, we have the icon in the United States. It's the day the earth stood still.
Huh. How do you mean?
Well, I mean the flying saucer
Yeah.
that comes offering peace. I mean, and that might be, the greatest science fiction movie of all time, but it is definitely an arriving house.
Huh. Quite literally, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is just that again.
Yeah.
Bigger and snazzier, but it's yeah, and I think it has morphed, and there were spooky stuff was happening in the 50s when lots and lots and lots of reports of flying saucers, things like that. And the people who were hired to debunk them had a residue of stuff they couldn't debunk and got kind of crazy about it because their money was in finding other explanations and they couldn't quite. That's the story I get anyhow. So it may have already kind of morphed in that way without the Catholics getting any credit for it.
Interesting.
Now, I'm as a McAllister graduate who's always been, I confess, somewhat dubious about the place, just as a place. It seems to me not a place where prayer is possible, if there are such things.
Yeah.
In fact, it may be a place in which it isn't possible in some but I don't know. I just have my own sensibility to work on. So what happens? I mean, I know the anthro people pretty well over there, have over the years. Reasonably secular crowd by and large. I know I've taught the students. What happens when this sort of stuff comes in contact with the refugees from every gifted program in the 5-state area?
There is recently at McAllister, there's been a big revival or a lot of energy coming from the Department of Religion. And so there are a lot of course offerings recently that I think have been compelling to students about articulating the power, not just of Catholicism, but of all religions, the place of religion in the world today. That it's something that's not actually diminished, but that's quite vibrant and changing. So I do actually get a significant number of students who are quite curious about trying to understand what religion is like today, what it was like before, and they are remarkably open-minded about the exercise of trying to take a miracle like this seriously. I think the classroom is sort of a safe space to engage in those ideas. I'm not sure that they would like march around campus being like, believe in miracles. But I think it's also a really healthy counterpoint to a lot of emphasis in academia today where these things are sort of dismissed out of hand. So I do get one or two students every semester who, and they're from many different faith traditions, not just Christian, who actually get excited about having a professor tell them it's okay to actually explore the possibility that something supernatural happened here. Right? Yeah.
It was odd. I mean, when I was at McAllister, 69 to 73, I was in a majority, I was in a minority, probably a minority of close to one, of people who never had anything odd happen. I mean, I was the Catholic, which go figure. But I mean, it was really weird.
On the irony of that.
But well, of course, people were taking a lot of chemicals, so you couldn't always trust their recollections. But I mean, the number of stories such that if they're true, physics, at least as we understand it, isn't. Mm-hmm. The number of stories I heard up and down the hall in a random dorm was just astonishing. The number of stories I get from my philosophy colleagues, if you get them drunk enough or listen long enough, of the one thing in their life they just don't quite get.
They don't quite
but
get it right.
That one thing, you don't need six things.
You just need one.
You just need one.
Uh-huh.
And anyhow, so I wonder. I always feel like there's a little dishonesty in people. They have that one thing that they sort of vaguely recall, but they would just as soon it hadn't happened. Yeah. And yet it did happen. Yeah. And no, and so they either have to kind of wall that off, or they have to somehow make space for a lot of other things.
Yeah.
The occasional things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, have flying houses now become your destiny? Are we fairly young? Are we going to pursue this for the next 50 years?
No. Actually, it's only one. It's the easiest way to explain my current book project, but it is only one chapter. I am looking at a lot of the other different ways in which Catholicism moves. It tends to usually attract people's attention in talks more than the other aspects that I talk about, like names and icons and atlases. So,
I see.
Yeah.
But are there any kind of major new emphases coming? I mean, you've got a book in progress. Where next?
There's one that I'm working on right now. It's a project on jaguars, actually, that came out of similar research materials. There's a lot of Jesuit materials in the Amazon where some Jesuits were writing about how jaguars were aiding in the conversion process because they were actually killing Mojos Indians who didn't convert, which was a really strange assertion to make. And so at first I thought it was a distortion of what was going on, but then I actually started digging through some of the records and saw that actually the jaguars in this particular region were killing a lot of people. And then I looked up modern jaguars, and they turn out to be one of the predatory cats that actually does not kill humans usually, unless there are some sort of strange extenuating circumstances. And that was really weird. So I kind of went back again with the question of what really did happen here, what was real, and then to look at sort of the overlay, both Jesuit and indigenous, and interpreting these kind of increases in jaguar deaths. And so my latest project is actually kind of a little bit more on the environmental side of religion. How did the environment, new environments and changes in the environment actually affect the way that religion spread? Can we actually seriously ask the question, did jaguars prompt conversion, right? How did jaguars affect conversion? Sort of as an independent agent, because obviously they don't have the same agenda as missionaries to spread Catholicism. But if you actually do chart things like animal attacks in certain areas, did they actually affect history? There hasn't been, it's sort of similar to the Holy House of Loretto, there hasn't been a lot of credence given to animals or rogue holy houses, right? They're not appreciated as agents that might have actually affected the course of history. People always look for humans near them as being the ones who are doing the changing. So I guess this new research project is getting me to sort of consider what happens if animals do change an outcome in a particular area. How do we interpret that today?
So the idea is that God deputizes the jaguar.
That's the Jesuit interpretation. Yes.
To increase, as it were,
Yes.
the likelihood
Yes.
of conversion by reducing the number of unbelievers.
And there's a lot of amazing stories from the field, from the Jesuits as well, kind of trying to process these deaths and attacks that they don't understand. Because, again, there's a lot of proximity to jaguars at this time, so they'll say things like, you know, we were eating dinner, two of us Jesuit missionaries, and a jaguar kind of walked through our dining room and then back out into the village, and people chased it out, but it's a miracle that it didn't kill us. And yet 3 days later, it killed someone who was kind of dubious Catholicism. So we were spared by God because we believe. And the unbelievers are being weeded out. Right? So, I mean, you have this interesting development of belief there going on.
You don't have to tell people they're going to go to hell. They'll get eaten.
Right? It seems very convenient. Yeah.
Yes, I love it. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for your time.
Thank you.